Hey, welcome back to the What If Machine. Now today we're going to do things a little different. This episode is all about assassins. So we're going to disgracefully cheat on our usual love science and instead run off for a week with its older sexy sibling history. Naughty. Dishonored, Assassin's Creed 3, Hitman Absolution. 3 major titles all coming out in the space of 2 months. Yep, it's fair to say assassins are in. But to what degree do hitmen in games relate to those from antiquity? Well, I took a trip to University College London History Department and sat down with 3 experts whose cumulative knowledge spanned ancient, medieval and American history. In particular, I wanted to find out one thing. When strapping on the boots of a digital assassin, as a rule you take on the role of a masked individual, literally in the case of Dishonored's Corvo. You must eliminate the target while trying your best to remain incognito. Your friends are stealth and subtlety, and often your target has no idea who you are. So, is this an accurate portrayal of how most assassinations in history have gone down? Well, I started by asking my 3 experts to tell me about their favourite assassinations in history. No gruesome details spared.
Number 1 leading assassination of all time has to be the killing in a theatre of Abraham Lincoln on Good Friday, 1865, by a leading Shakespearean actor. This was not some unknown madman jumping from a crowd or concealed on a grassy knoll or concealed inside a building. This was a major figure, John Wilkes Booth, from a big theatrical family, who killed Lincoln sitting in a box, watching a play, and then jumped dramatically onto the stage in front of the audience and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," death to all tyrants, and then ran from the theatre as the audience sat there stunned. John Wilkes Booth wanted everybody to know who had killed Lincoln. If people hadn't known it was him, that would have been as big a failure for him as not killing him in the first place. Lincoln to him was this great tyrant who had crushed the South, who had acted in an illegitimate, tyrannical way, who had led this war in which innocent people had been killed. He was the agent of redemption, and he was an actor. So of course he wanted to kill Lincoln in a theatre. Of course he, John Wilkes Booth, wanted to be the star of the show. He was not a masked assassin skulking in the shadows, quite the contrary.
Well, as Adam made clear, Wilkes Booth certainly doesn't conform to the typical protagonist from the likes of Assassin's Creed or Hitman. Let's hear from our other 2 experts.
Obviously, at the top, known to most people, is the assassination of Julius Caesar. It's done in public, on the steps of the building where the Senate is about to meet. The trend is for the knife to come from someone known to the person who's murdered. So just like murders in general, you're much more likely to be murdered or assassinated by someone close to you, known to you, whose face you know, even if perhaps you don't know their name. So they might be a soldier in your bodyguard, you might not personally know their name, but their face would be familiar, and therefore that allows them to get close enough to carry the deed out. Well, obviously with Caesar, he feels secure in the company of the people who murder him. They get close enough to stab him in the back.
Certainly the most famous, or one of the most famous assassinations in history is the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was killed in his cathedral in 1170 by a group of what we can call hitmen, who killed him quite violently and brutally. That murder was one of the most notorious, especially because the murder happened in the cathedral.
From these 3 examples anyway, it seems that the norm in history is far from the unknown masked hitman archetype we're used to in games. But this is in no way a bad thing. In fact, the role of the masked assassin creates a great platform for some excellent stealthy gameplay. Okay, but what about the tools of the assassin's trade? In the digital world, we are often spoilt for choice when it comes to gruesome ways of dealing with our targets. In fact, here's a montage. So I put the question to our three experts. What were the weapons of choice for our historical assassins? And did any time period feature the favourite of the Assassin's Creed franchise, the Hidden Blade?
In every case of the killing of an American president, a gun was the weapon of choice. In some cases, such as the killing of Lincoln, which was done at point-blank range from behind him, or the killing of Garfield in a station, which was done from in front of him, but again at pretty much point-blank range, that was up close and personal. In other cases, such as the famous example of Lee Harvey Oswald killing Kennedy, it wasn't up close and personal, it was from a distance. If you want to skip over to the only example of the assassination of a British Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, the assassin, walked up to Perceval and ran him through with a sword.
Blades are hidden, but then they are usually hidden under clothing, and they're conventional blades. They're not ones that sort of emerge by some mechanism. Or they're ones that are carried openly by, for instance, bodyguards, but blades that, of course, the person who's assassinated doesn't expect to be used against them, but used to protect them.
There are two main weapons. One is the sword, the favorite weapon for an assassination, and in this case, obviously, the assassin had to come really close to the to the victim. And this is quite interesting because often our sources portray the assassin as someone who disguises himself. Sometimes he's a jester, sometimes he's kind of someone who the king wouldn't suspect as being an assassin.
Interesting to see Antonio reference disguises, as this fits in nicely with a prominent feature of contemporary assassination games. It's certainly a major gameplay mechanic of upcoming Hitman game Absolution. An essential part of creating a convincing assassin experience is making a believable scenario and setting for the murder to take place. Assassin's Creed 3 does this quite wonderfully in the very first mission, where you play and your mission is to assassinate a person of importance sitting in the theatre box during a play. Ring any bells? But it's not just Assassin's Creed. The premise of the story Dishonored shares some remarkable similarity to the likely murder of the Roman emperor by his successor Diocletian.
Being the lead of the bodyguard of the emperor who has died under suspicious circumstances, manages to deflect criticism from him by accusing the Praetorian prefect, who you might imagine is sort of prime minister stroke secretary of state, on the spot, accusing him of having poisoned the emperor, and therefore deflecting from the possibility that he might be accused of the emperor's death.
Emperor murdered perhaps by the bodyguard but blamed on another figure at court? Essentially, Dishonored's story flipped on its head. Well, all this similarity to history is no accident. I caught up with Steve Masters, lead game designer on Assassin's Creed 3, and asked him about his team's approach to incorporating history into the game.
So when we're choosing our targets in Assassin's Creed, history is our playground, and when we're choosing who's going to be an assassination target, we make sure that it's somebody who actually died in history in the time and location that we're looking for. But what we look for is ambiguity in how this person died. So for example, if you find out that there was this commander who died on a battlefield, was he shot or was he stabbed? Was there a hint of friendly fire? This is something that, is a gold mine for us. This is something where we can come in and insert the Assassin's Creed story inside of the history. We actually have a historian on staff whose job is just to find us interesting moments in history that fit within our narrative. So, they spend almost a year trawling through different histories, different accounts of the era, identifying potential targets, make sure that what we tell in our world, in our story, is actually completely compatible with the actual events of what happened.
Finally, I asked our experts about consequences. In the vast majority of assassination missions in video games, a successful hit generally has a desired outcome. For example, in the case of Dishonored, for the most part, a successful mission results in the intended political gain for Corvo and the Resistance. But is this the case in history?
I think he'd hoped that the whole South would rise again in response to his actions. It's had a global impact that was incredible at the time. It's hard for us to realize quite how much emotional impact the assassination of Lincoln had, not just in the United States, but around the world. When the news of Lincoln's assassination reached London, there were special editions of newspapers, mass meetings held in Hyde Park and other places around Britain, reports of people reading the special issues of newspapers, weeping openly in the street. This is in Britain, not just in the United States.
In a sense, it leads to, ultimately, ironically, the defeat of the party that hoped to benefit most. And it opens the way up for those to establish, in a sense, a much better grounded absolutist regime than Caesar had ever himself probably intended.
If the king wanted to get rid of Thomas Becket as a very difficult and kind of larger-than-life churchman, the worst thing he could have done was to kill him in that way, because making him a martyr and a saint, basically Thomas Becket became a symbol of any church resistance against the will of the king. Often the consequences are not the ones that the murderers had intended.
Well, that's it for another episode of the What If Machine. Or maybe because it's been history, it's the What Did Machine, whatever. Anyway, let me know what you thought of the show in the comments, or if you prefer, hit me up on Twitter at CamFrazRob using the hashtag WhatIfMachine. Coming up next week.
Within our lifetime, and hopefully within my career, we will discover evidence of life beyond our planet.